This opportunity to address you, and especially to Ed for the invitation. What a remarkable and fascinating program this is, and it's an honor to be a part of it. Ed had asked me to give an overview of the history of the Sephardic Jewish community here in Sarajevo, and then to end with a little bit of time about my own work and my own research, which in a way makes sense because that is really the concluding chapter, unfortunately, of the Sephardic community in this city. Unfortunately, like the Sephardim all around the world today, they are only a small fraction of the vibrant and thriving cultural and religious and linguistic community that once lived here in Sarajevo. Actually, on the eve of the Second World War, they comprised 10% of the city's population, which is a significant number, even among other Balkan cities and also throughout Europe. Yet very, very little research has been done on the Sephardim in this region, and there are a few reasons generally offered for this. One is, and this might be probably the most familiar to you, on Sephardim generally, was that early scholarship on Jewish history came out of Israel. The founders of Israel were predominantly Ashkenazi, and the history tended to have a slant in that direction. As Jewish history became established as a field in the rest of the world, and in its own right, studies of European Jewry didn't really know how to incorporate Ottoman history, because so much of the Sephardic experience was part of the Ottoman or post-Ottoman experience. And is Ottoman Empire Europe? Is it the Middle East? Do we study it with Turkey? And so it often became relegated to the domain of Ottoman studies. Then there were some reasons within Yugoslavia itself why the Sephardim got significantly less attention than other communities. After the Holocaust, there was a very small number of Jews who survived throughout the former Yugoslavia, and they created an official Jewish community based primarily in Belgrade, but with chapters throughout the region. And part of their goal was to foster a unified Jewish identity, which didn't really leave much room for specific Sephardic community, cultural, educational resources. But since the recent war in Bosnia in the 90s, there's actually been a tremendous effort, both within the larger community of Sarajevo and also within the Jewish community of Sarajevo, to revive Sephardic tradition. And actually, tomorrow night, I'm not sure if you've heard, there's the Sephardic cooking exhibit, and there's various Sephardic events that are going on in the city this month. And that's pretty common, actually. I've been to a number of Ladino concerts, and I've been invited to the synagogue on various holidays for cooking events and speeches, and there really seems to be a tremendous effort within Sarajevo to revive this local tradition, which is, I think, pretty wonderful. So, sort of to give you a very broad history in a very short period of time. As most of you know, I'm sure, in 1492, the Jews were expelled from Spain and they sought exile in the East. And the Sephardim primarily settled in the Balkans, in North Africa, and in the Levant. In Sarajevo, small groups started to arrive in the 16th century, coming largely via Florence and then from the coast of Dalmatia. And there was really an appeal to settling in Ottoman towns because of the Ottoman social and political structure, which allowed the Sephardim to preserve very close, tight communal bonds and culture. And again, I'm not sure how much of this has already been covered, but the Ottomans worked with religious communities, not with individuals. So for every religious community, there was taxes were paid through the religious community, legal matters, socio-religious matters, internal religious affairs, also education. All of that was handled through the religious community, which gave it a sense of cohesion that allowed the Sephardim to sort of maintain and preserve certain cultural codes. The center of the Sephardic community was the rabbi. He was funded by the congregation. He was in charge of adjudicating lawsuits, like elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire. And the power of the Sephardic rabbis wasn't just kind of a sort of side step. It was actually formally recognized by the Ottoman government in 1622. Now, unlike a lot of places, the Sephardim weren't just allowed to settle in Sarajevo. They were actually quite welcomed. And in the 16th century, the Ottoman government built housing for Sephardic families downtown near the central market. And by the early 19th century, there were several distinct Sephardic communities within the city, each within predominantly Muslim areas. And the community tended to work in trade, artisanal work, crafts, textiles, and it was very much integrated in the city itself. Moving into the 19th century, the Ottomans had some massive centralization and modernization reforms. And it came primarily in two waves, and the goal was to reduce religious power, to centralize and standardize the empire along European lines, and to essentially make the Ottoman Empire more of a European state. And there are a number of different things that affected the Sephardic community and other non-Muslims as well. Standard conscription was introduced. There was a public trial system which moved legal authority out of the hands of the congregation and into the hands of a centralized legal authority. There was a new taxing structure, set tax structure based on individuals, not on the religious community. And also non-Muslims, including Sephardic Jews, could enter public offices, civil and military positions. Now, there were a lot of pros and cons to this set of reforms. On the one hand, equality was understood as positive. It opens doors, it reduces discrimination, it allows for a more modernizing, secularizing culture. But on the other hand, many religious leaders viewed the reforms as an erosion of their legal autonomy because it stripped power from the central rabbinical, or from the center of rabbinical power and moves it to secular state civic structures. Also, very few non-Muslims actually became involved in high-ranking positions across the Ottoman Empire, especially in Sarajevo, where Muslim elites continued to hold significant power all the way until 1918. Interestingly, instead of gaining power at an empire level, Sarajevo's Sephardim became involved in local governance in the late 19th century. In 1865, the Ottomans established a regional council in Sarajevo that was composed of both Muslim and non-Muslim representatives. And they actually assigned seats on the basis of religion. So there were Muslim, Catholic, Orthodox, and Jewish seats. And this local council actually persisted in some form all the way through the interwar era, so that it gave Sephardim a political voice that they didn't necessarily have in other places. Now, my students in the US, whenever I'm teaching Ottoman history, they always ask me the question, was life better for Jews in the Ottoman Empire? Now, it seems like it was better, but was it? And it's a tough question because we take it from contemporary standards of equality and discrimination, and of course, it doesn't seem like it was really a great place to live. There were definitely restrictions and limitations on what Jews could do. Inequality pervaded the Ottoman Empire, which prioritized Muslims. Jews were not allowed, had to wear different clothing, distinguishing clothing and headgear. Their buildings had to be lower than other buildings. They were prohibited, like other non-Muslims, from carrying weapons or from riding horses or camels. But comparatively to other European countries at the exact same time, Sephardic Jews and Jews generally in the Ottoman Empire had significant more freedom. They were welcomed as refugees. There were waves that came from various parts of Europe, not just from Spain, but also from France and Central Europe. And Sarajevo never experienced any kind of severe violence toward the Sephardic community, such as pogroms or accusations of blood libel. Now, such attacks actually did occur in other parts of the Ottoman Empire, which people don't often talk about. There were small, periodically in other places, but they were significantly less salient in the Ottoman Empire than in Northern and Eastern Europe, and they were non-existent in Sarajevo. So, in 1878, Austria-Hungary occupied Bosnia, Herzegovina, and in 1908, it formally annexed the region. And this is known as the Habsburg period. And this period became known for political and economic modernization, urbanization, and the gradual secularization of state and society. So in many ways, it continued that process that had begun under the Ottoman reform era. Like other religious communities, the Sephardim became subject to state control. But nevertheless, the community continued to function as a community. It didn't, the Habsburg era didn't create sort of an individual empire relationship. It continued to foster and allow for the fostering of religious communities. And there was a pretty particular reason for this. And that was that they were struggling against nationalism. And nationalist groups tended to they viewed the occupation as in negative terms, and they wanted to overthrow it. But allowing and working with some of the religious communities allowed the Habsburg authorities to sort of bypass nationalist roots, but continue to have good relations with people. So during this period, we start to see the gradual assimilation of the Sephardim, the introduction of secular schools and state bureaucratization. Increasingly, Sephardim began to speak the local Slavic language, known variously across different historical periods as Bosnian, Serbo-Croatian, or simply our language, naši jezik. By 1931, about 50% of Sarajevo's Sephardim still spoke Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish dialect, at home, as their primary language. Now, this percentage might seem low, only 50%, but in fact it was significantly higher than almost any other city in the Balkans. Even Salonika, where there was a very strong and vibrant Sephardic community. So I think Sarajevo, in many ways, by the early 20th century, speaks to a sort of success story of how the Sephardim were able to maintain a very distinct linguistic, cultural, and religious community that could both integrate into the larger civic community, but also preserve its own cultural integrity. Now, a major change occurred in the late Habsburg era, which was that the Sephardim were no longer the only Jewish community in Sarajevo. Although a handful of Ashkenazim had lived in the city during the Ottoman era, the community, sort of a large established community of Ashkenazim, were formed in the 1880s when a wave of Ashkenazi immigrants arrived from other parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, the new immigrants tended to speak German. They built their own administrations, their own graveyards, their own synagogue, their own organizations, and they pretty much were completely disconnected from the Sephardic institutions. Moreover, they interacted differently with other local communities. They didn't have or share the legacy and traditions of sort of multicultural, multi-religious living that the Sephardim had had. They quickly began to dominate many aspects of what would become known as modern society: the bureaucracy, medicine, education, industry. And a sort of a major source of contention that emerged in the early 20th century and would persist through the interwar period was that Sarajevo Sephardim were generally a poor community, whereas the Ashkenazim started to have more money. And also, the Ashkenazim tended to function as a national community. They were interacting politically and nationally in different ways than the local Sarajevo Sephardim. Consequently, the Sephardim, like other Sarajevans, perceived the Ashkenazi as different, and the two communities existed pretty much separately until the 1920s. Now, at the end of this First World War, there was another huge political shift in this region when Bosnia became incorporated into a new state, that of Yugoslavia. And at first it had a different name, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, but commonly, especially in history books, it's just known as the Yugoslav period. Now, for many Jews, Yugoslavia presented a lesser evil than other European nation states because the country was founded on an idea that all South Slavs could become part of this umbrella nation, Yugoslav, which actually means South Slav. So rather than in other countries where national movements were focused on being Hungarian and having sort of that religious dimension, the Yugoslav identity welcomed Muslims, Orthodox Serbs, Catholics, and Jews. Now, on the local level, the Sephardim continued to operate as a separate cultural and religious community, interacting with Yugoslav politics as necessary, but also maintaining a local identity. They comprised about 85% of Sarajevo's 10,000 Jews in the interwar period and were an integral part of the city's social fabric. Of the city's 8 synagogues, 7 were Sephardic, and the Sephardim continued to maintain their distinct linguistic and cultural traditions. Many Sephardic families continued to live in Muslim residential neighborhoods, and they owned shops adjacent to their Muslim neighbors in the bazaars. So it was a really integrated city in that way, with various religious communities living and working together. Now, the rigid division that we saw in the late 19th century between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim persisted, though there were signs in Sarajevo that it was starting to relax. In the early 1920s, a handful of progressive Sephardim joined the Ashkenazim to foster a new Yugoslav Jewish identity. They founded a Jewish club in the city in 1927 and a Jewish newspaper. However, in terms of marriage, religious organization, religious institutional structures, burial customs, the two communities remained separate. And many Sephardim actually preferred it that way. Indeed, there was a significant local movement to protect and preserve local Sephardic culture, which tends to get known as more of a traditional movement that viewed modernization, secularization, assimilation cautiously. And there were similar movements that formed in the city's Muslim communities and Catholic communities as well in the interwar era. In 1928, Sarajevo Sephardim established a rabbinical seminary which reflected its more traditional orientation and emphasized preserving Sephardic, not just Jewish, culture and life and traditions. And the seminary sent rabbis to other smaller Sephardic communities across the region, including to Kosovo and Albania and Dalmatia and Serbia. And Sarajevo thus became really a central node in a broader Sephardic network throughout this region. Now, in many ways, this reflected the Sephardist movement, which had emerged in the late 19th century, centered in Vienna, which sought to pose an alternative to Zionism, which was obviously the more famous and the more powerful European Jewish movement. I'm not sure if you've already discussed the Sephardist movement in your talks here. So just briefly, I'll say that it was founded in Vienna in the late Habsburg era, and it was understood as a counter-movement to Zionism. Sarajevo Sephardim were involved in the earliest days. There were a number of students studying in Vienna at the time who became involved. And the movement aimed to reconfirm Sephardic identity, which Sephardic Jews believed was indistinguishable from their Jewish identity. The movement didn't have an immigration angle the way that Zionism did. Instead of seeking to create a separate Jewish homeland and state, it wanted to preserve Sephardic culture within its existing communities and to protect Sephardic life in the face of assimilation from nationalism and nation states. Now, importantly, in Sarajevo, sort of this distinction between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim would have significant consequences in the interwar period. Primarily, when anti-Semitism first started to emerge in Sarajevo, it actually had a very distinct anti-Ashkenazi slant. Sephardim were understood as locals. They were nashi, ours, as members of the local civic community, whereas Ashkenazi were understood as foreigners. They had come from somewhere else. They spoke a different language. Immediately after the First World War, local authorities in Bosnia and in Croatia began a campaign to try to remove foreign German-speaking Ashkenazim on the grounds that they supported the Habsburg monarchy or that they were communists. But foreign literally meant just that, immigrants from abroad. Concepts of racial foreignness, which become so prevalent during the Second World War and our understanding of Nazism, didn't resonate yet, especially not in Sarajevo. Now, there were other instances where anti-Semitism started to rear its head in the 20s and 30s when Sarajevo's lower classes, including many Sephardic Jews, started to blame German and Slovene and other Central European immigrants during the recession and then the Depression. They blamed them for the city's high unemployment, their low salaries, the failed crafts industries, and this group happened to include a number of Ashkenazi Jews. So we see sort of a distinction being made both within the Jewish community and also within the larger city. And this idea of Jews as being foreigners was then reinforced in 1938 after the Anschluss, the occupation, annexation of Austria by Germany, Nazi Germany, when another wave of new refugee immigrants arrived in Sarajevo. Gradually, by the late 1930s, however, anti-Semitism in Sarajevo was not limited to Ashkenazim, and it did assume a pan-Jewish characteristic. And this is despite really strong efforts by local Sephardim to remind their neighbors of their long and peaceful history of living and working together. In 1941, on the eve of the Second World War, a group of prominent Muslims issued an anti-Semitic decree that literally called on the town to remove its Jews. Catholic and Serbian Orthodox religious publications joined in this anti-Semitic tirade, publishing various fascist-inspired propaganda that blamed Jews as a collective for the region's political, economic, and moral problems. While anti-Semitism never became as pervasive in Sarajevo as it would in other parts of the region, especially in Croatia, it did exist in 1941 in certain groups and among certain publications and milieus. Now, in April of 1941, around the time when Ed was quoting from that part of the book, the Germans, Nazi Germany, invaded and occupied Yugoslavia, and Sarajevo became incorporated into a Nazi satellite state called the Independent State of Croatia. This state was run by the Ustasha regime, which was infamous for its brutality and its genocidal campaign. Immediately after the Germans arrived, they destroyed the new Sephardic Jewish synagogue, they burned all its libraries and archives, they seized prime Jewish real estate to house German military and civic administrators. And then, following the example set in Nazi Germany, they also introduced the Ustasha, local Ustasha regime, introduced racial legislation that barred Jews from citizenship, public activities like going to the movies, marrying non-Jews, owning businesses, and then this was progressively followed by increasingly severe measures forcing Jews to register for hard labor, and then their internment, deportation to concentration and extermination camps. And the deportations began in September of 1941, and they were primarily finished by December of that year, although there were a few more that went on through 1942. One of the reasons that I first told Ed I was going to, we were talking about this presentation, and I said, I'm going to show some images, I'll put some pictures up. It's always nice to have visual images to go along with a lecture. And then I started putting my images together and realizing that they're all of the Holocaust, because of course the 20th century is the era when we have more images, and I didn't want the entire time that I was standing here for you to be looking at pictures of death and destruction. So then I decided, you know what, if you'd like to see photographs from that period, you're welcome to look in the book, and they're also available in various places online. So Jews had a number of different options during the Second World War. There were a number who escaped by joining the communist partisans. This is often touted, especially in the Yugoslav communist historiography, as a primary way that Jews could survive. But it should be noted that some of those partisan units were actually quite anti-Semitic, and there was one famous instance where a group of Sephardic Jews were literally turned away from Sephardic Jews from Sarajevo, turned away by the partisans and not allowed to join them. There were other Jews who fled via Italy, Italian routes to Mostar and Split and Zadar, and made their way to Italy. Some Sephardim actually fled east and south to Kosovo and Albania and Macedonia, using local Sephardic networks that had formed partly through trade and economic relations in the past and partly through the rabbinical seminary that had been formed in the late 1920s. Unfortunately, when the Germans then occupied these areas later, many of these Jews met the exact fate of those who had stayed in Sarajevo. I'd also like to note that, interestingly, in the course of my research, I came across a significant number of Jews who converted to Islam and to Catholicism in the early part of the Nazi occupation period. Now, in other parts of Europe, we see conversion sort of prior to the extreme Nazi occupation, but the fact that this conversion began and persisted during the period of the Holocaust is quite unique to Sarajevo, and around 20% of the city's population in some way was able to get at least a paper conversion. Unfortunately, my paper trail always ran cold, and I couldn't figure out. I have documents from the Italian consulate, from the city's the mayor's office, from various religious communities that document name changes and where people were going and how they converted. But then we don't know. I can't follow what happened to them after, and everyone always asks me, well, did they survive? And unfortunately, I actually don't know the answer to that. It would seem surprising that they did all survive, because we know that not that many Jews survived in the region. But exactly how that conversion helped them to escape, one can imagine it did in different particular familial cases. So it's always hardest for me to lecture on the Second World War, because that's the topic I wrote my book on. And I feel like I want to give every detail of every story, and that it's impossible to understand the complexity of Sarajevo in 20 minutes. So instead, what I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you briefly 2 anecdotes about Sarajevo Jews from during the Second World War, and how I seek to integrate them into the city's wartime history. So there was a woman named Berta, and she was a neighborhood hairdresser in downtown Sarajevo, and she had a very loyal clientele. That she was Jewish didn't seem to bother her patrons in this multi-religious city. But when the German tanks rolled in April 1941 and the Ustasha took power, Berta's business came under attack, like other Jewish businesses. The regime appointed an Aryan trustee, as it did for all Jewish businesses, to oversee and take over Berta's salon. But as her replacement began to complain to the local Ustasha police in frequent letters of complaint, Berta continued to see people in her home. And he was sure to note that this was illegal and that she was doing it secretly. Now, clearly, by continuing to patronize her, Berta's clients were also refusing to abide by the new discriminatory legislation that was being implemented in the town, despite risks of persecution posed by the regime. And indeed, local Sarajevo newspapers have articles at various points during the war literally telling people, you have to stop going to Jewish businesses or you will be arrested. So it begs the question, were they risking such persecution just for a good hairdo? Very unlikely. 3 months later, local Sarajevo police found themselves confronted with another awkward situation. They had deported a Jewish man, a local Jewish man, and his Catholic housekeeper had decided to stay in his home to protect it from looting, she claimed. But now she demanded from the police payment, because she said, I'd stayed in this apartment this house for 3 months, and I want my salary. Now, it was a fairly straightforward request, and one would have expected the police to either sympathize with her and just pay her salary, or to deny the claim on the grounds that nobody had asked her to stay in his house in the first place. But the policemen felt very uneasy, and as it became clear in document after document, they felt caught up in the vagaries of the new laws and the new regime, and they didn't think it was right to take money from the Jewish man's estate without his permission. Now, their intent isn't entirely clear, but what I would suggest from this case and from others was that, frankly, they weren't exactly sure what would happen when their Jewish neighbors returned. And they weren't entirely sure that this was the end. And they didn't want to be the responsible bureaucrats who had handed out money without permission. So they began a multi-month investigation to find the man. They tracked him through various transit camps, various concentration camps. They finally find him in Jasenovac, which is an infamous Ustasha concentration camp, often known as the Auschwitz of Croatia. There they find the man and they requested that he sign a form giving permission for the police to pay his housekeeper, which he did. Not that he really had any choice. And the camp commandant actually signed as his witness. They then send the paperwork back through all the channels, and it arrives in Sarajevo, where the local police decide, great, now we can pay the housekeeper. So one of the questions that I try to raise in my work is, where do stories like these fit into our history of the Holocaust, and how do we integrate them into our understanding of this historical period? The small gestures like haircuts generally get relegated to the domain of anecdote. Okay, so some woman, some hairdresser was cutting hair in a house. But but in fact they can be a lens from which we try to analyze how people were living and surviving during this period. Now, the policeman's gestures fall way outside the scope of what we normally think of as resistance, acts of deliberately or inadvertently trying to help Jews. These officers didn't have much empathetic interest in helping the Jewish homeowner. They weren't trying to track him down in Yasenovats to send him a care package of food and goods. They just wanted his permission. They were following procedural norms and trying to maintain a sense of civility in their own offices. They were covering their backs. But it also, this instance highlights that they acknowledged a sense of injustice within this process. That there was an injustice inherent in the new property laws of taking people's property without actually getting their permission to do so. And it highlights the discomfort that people felt, bureaucrats working with the regime in the employment of the fascists, but also struggling with the everyday decisions of what that meant. So in my book, I try to weave these stories together in order to build a framework for understanding these nuances of everyday life and the dilemmas of customers and cops and how their stories contribute or suggest a complexity and difficulty of actually living through the Holocaust and what that meant, especially in an area with a long history of multiculturalism and deep cross-religious ties. And I suggest at various points in my work that many of these stories reveal an instinctive, a reflective instinct among Sarajevans to protect local relationships and to maintain certain codes of civility that had governed the town for so long. And these local norms had persisted in various ways through the various wars, the collapse of empires, the introduction and dissolution of new states. And so I argue in the book that in its own way, multiculturalism actually persisted in Sarajevo despite of the Holocaust. And so it's a complex argument, and I'm open to discussion and debate about it with audiences. But I think that it helps us try to make sense of this complex period from more social and cultural terms. So after the war, to return briefly to our narrative of the Sephardim, many Sarajevo Jews, a small number of Sarajevo Jews did return to the city. Among those who came back, some became involved with the Communist Party and affiliated with state-funded Yugoslav Jewish community. Among those who did not, there were a number who became victimized by the new regime, like others who rejected the new system. In 1948, many were encouraged to give up their property in exchange for immigration to Israel, Italy, and later the United States, and there were small numbers who did. And others continued to assimilate into the new state, working with local and national Jewish communities in the formation of a distinct Yugoslav national identity, which I began with in the start of this talk. And that sort of persisted in different ways until the Bosnian Wars, when now we have sort of this revival of a sense of a distinct Sephardic cultural and religious heritage that is once again being promoted. So I think I'll actually stop there because I see we are running into your scheduled tour time and open it for questions about the history of the Sephardim or specifically on the Second World War, if you'd like.
I'll
Yes.
take the first right of
Okay.
the question. There are two things that perhaps you could address, because I think people would find it that I'm curious about. And one thing I think they would be curious about, do you know the narrative, the story of Rabbi Danon, who's buried in Stolats?
No, I'm not familiar with
That
it.
was from Moritz Levy's book. We'll go over that later. I know that Yakitin knows about 1806 or 1820. 1820. We'll do that. That's not your area. But what about Jacovo? Do you have? What makes Jacovo unique is that it is was a concentration camp set up by the Ustasha, who who deported mostly women and children from Sarajevo, where they basically starved them to death.
Yeah.
And what makes it unique is that it's the only concentration camp that I know of which each victim has a name. And I don't know how they actually got those names.
My understanding is that it was actually the Catholic Church that insisted on giving burial. No? So.
It was a caretaker in Jakovo who was professional, who was running the cemetery. And whenever from the camp they said, we have one person to be buried, he asked for the name and he put these plaques with the names. And that's how around 600 names, graves with the names, was saved. And just this year, we changed the plaques. And the original, few originals will be sent to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. They asked for it.
Very interesting. The only thing I will say, and I want you to, but the thing that I've come to, I work with a lot of politicians. And one thing I've finally gotten to notice when I moved into the 16th district of Vienna, which probably has more Turks and Yugoslavs than are in Turkey or in ex-Yugoslavia. And one of the things that I noticed is the difference between national politicians and local politicians. National politicians can always talk big. They can always talk about big movements. They can spew hatred. They can talk grand ideas. But once you're a local politician in your district, you basically spend all day scratching your head, standing around with people who are your constituents. So when you have for Bayram and you have Muslim holidays where you need to find a way to slaughter a sheep, you have to figure out how to do that in a way that's clean and sanitary. When you have Jewish holidays, you want to talk with the people to see if you don't want to offend anyone this way. And therefore, the more local a politician is, the more practical they are. And this is a lot of what you get, that's at least my reading from living in that part of it, and this is what you get so well from the dichotomy between, I remember one of your great lines in the book was that how the Ustasha, this radical nutcase group of Croatian Catholic fascists, managed to antagonize the Archbishop of Sarajevo. You've got to work real hard to do that.
Especially one who was publishing sort of poems in honor of the head of the Ustasha movement.
And they managed to insult him. Anyway, so I'm sure you have a few questions or points. Being teachers, you'll simply want to correct.
I just picked up right now, and I thought I would just pass it around in case you want to see it, a new book that came out from the State Archives here, and it was partially funded by the Holocaust Museum in DC, in which they did simultaneous English and Bosnian letters that were found of a Jewish man, Haim Altarac, who received letters and requests from various concentration camps around in Croatia, into the independent state of Croatia and in Bosnia during the war. And so it's just a really neat tool. I know I'm going to use parts of it for my students, but if you want to just take a look, I'd be happy to pass it around. Yes, you want to read the name?
The book is, it's both languages, and I'll read the English. It's called Letters to Haim Altarac from Concentration Camp During World War II. And we'll look around for it, and looks interesting. So we'll pass it around. We'll see if we can find copies. There are 2 English language bookstores in town. You see one right now. Go out of the hotel. One's right there, and there's another one this way. So, floor is open for discussion. We have a few minutes.
Yes.
Sorry?
Please.
Can you please say something to incorporate how the Nazis treated in Sarajevo the other communities, for instance, especially the Muslim community, and in comparison to the Jewish community?
Sure, absolutely.
And when you, now that I'm the expert on your book, and just so you'll get it right in your head, because this is what I learned, it's the value of the book. When you say the Nazis, don't forget you had two different competing groups almost of fascists here.
Mm-hmm.
Don't forget there were the Nazis, let's say the Wehrmacht, the Nazis, and the Ustascha.
Right.
Yes, but there's
So-
there's a clear distinction.
Yeah, so which I just wanted to.
I'm interested, especially in terms of race policy.
Yeah, so primarily the Catholic and the Muslim communities were understood as racially Aryan, and they were their collaboration was welcomed. The Serb community, which was under the primary target of the Croat Ustaša regime, was not the Nazis sort of didn't really deal with them in racial terms. But they did work closely with Muslims and Catholics. Part of what happens during the war is sort of a power competition where local Muslims, local Catholics, the Ustascha and the Nazis don't agree on what should be happening. And so you see various kinds, you see various kinds of alliances and collaborative efforts that occur at different points. And it changes. One of my I think one of the most fascinating anecdotes is that there's this group of Muslim leaders who on the eve of war published this resolution, this anti-Semitic resolution calling on other Muslims to remove Jews. And then 6 months later, almost an identical group of Muslim leaders in Sarajevo publish another public resolution arguing that genocide and ethnic cleansing is wrong, and criticizing, essentially in the middle of the Holocaust, criticizing deportations and unnecessary violence, and calling for trials and a fair system. Then you fast forward a year later, and this same exact group of Muslims is petitioning Adolf Hitler to create a Bosnian Muslim state and its own militia, which will then become a Bosnian Muslim. Sort of the way that the Nazis respond to that is to create a Bosnian Muslim Waffen-SS unit, which is not what the Muslim leadership wanted. And then, in fact, they continue, and you have sort of breakaway groups, because what they really wanted was political power and a state, and the Germans don't want to give it to them. They want conscripts who are going to go and fight the partisans in eastern Bosnia. So they try to use the rhetoric. And it's a complex story, and I'm not going to go into it all because I know you guys are in a rush. But I'm happy to correspond more or talk more about it. There's a chapter in the book about it.
Do we have any other points or questions? It's either more questions or the heat. I would like you maybe to address just something about the Handjar. This was in the Vienna, I sent you a picture, I think, in the Military Museum of Vienna. We didn't go into that part of the museum, but they actually have a fez with a fez, worn by Muslims, with an SS symbol, the skull on it. And there was a division, the Handjar division of the SS. And could you make just a couple of comments about that?
Yes, well, this is the Bosnian Muslim SS unit. It was called the Handjar Division. It was formed in 1943. And it's fascinating to actually read Himmler's letters about its formation, which can be found in Germany, but can also be found actually in the U.S. at the Hoover Archives in California. And they were writing about this because the Germans wanted to sort of have a division of Muslims in order to get more troops on the ground. But at the same time, they had to respect and incorporate the demands of Muslim leaders. And so they appoint imams, and they have letters back and forth about how you can feed the Germans pork, but you can't feed the Handjar division pork, and trying to figure out how to integrate them. And there actually was a discussion that went on about sort of how Islam as a racial category can be understood vis-a-vis Aryanism, and that these two things are distinct, but yet they can coexist. And the division existed from 1943 for about a year and a half. Various troops actually left at different points. Some of them deserting to join Ustaša units, some of them deserting to join partisan units. And so it was a very sort of fluid group that showed the people, actually the conscripts and the recruits within it, weren't entirely sure what their mission was at any given time. And the Nazis never clearly defined it, trying to sort of cater to all sides.
And actually, being typically Bosnian, these guys, once they were actually realized that they had to go out and work, they had a revolution, they overthrew their German overlords and they quit. Being real Sareli, they weren't actually going to do anything. I think I want to thank Emily Greble.
Thank you all.
If you have any